So, 12:30 p.m., November 22nd, 1963, JFK is shot during his motorcade. We covered all of that in part 1. Welcome to part 2. And if you like this video, don't forget to like and subscribe. So, President Kennedy was shot, and his wife, Jacqueline Kennedy, I had mentioned in video 1, dove over the back of the car. I believe I actually misspoke, saying that she reached out to the Secret Service, but according to a more recent interview with Secret Service Agent Hill, she was actually grabbing for some of his skull and brain matter that had flown back onto the trunk of the limousine, and he pushed her back into the car for her own safety, and they sped up and took off out of there. And he actually remained kind of on the back of the vehicle. So she had pulled him into her lap, her husband, President Kennedy, not Agent Hill. And Agent Hill, he kind of wedged himself in the seat and was propped up over the back of the seat, over the back of the car, the whole way to the hospital, which was only about a 4-minute drive, I think is what he said. And they were going about 70 miles an hour on the nearby highway all the way to Parkland Memorial Hospital. So right after he was shot, Jacqueline shouted, "Oh, Jack, what have they done? They've shot his head off. I have his brains in my hand. I love you, Jack." Which prompted me to kind of look into something, because his name was not Jack. But apparently back in the day, that was considered a common nickname for John. And so she would refer to him as Jack, and apparently those that were closest commonly did so. And so going back, Agent Hill, he was wedged in over the back of the seat, and they made their way to Parkland Memorial Hospital via Stemmons Freeway. And they were led by the police chief. He had gotten in front of them and shown them the way, because apparently, obviously they weren't familiar with the area. That would be Chief Curry that led them to the hospital. And agents or police had phoned ahead to the hospital, so the emergency room was prepared for them. So they had prepared emergency rooms 1 and 2. And when they arrived, they had to get Connolly out first in order to get to the president. And so Governor Connolly was wheeled into emergency room 2. And Jacqueline didn't want to let him go. She had her arms around him, and Secret Service Agent Hill had to kind of plead with her, "Please, can you let him go so we can get him in and get him help?" She didn't budge. She said it again. And then in an interview that I saw, he claimed that he understood her thinking because he knew them fairly well, having been with them for some time, and he thought, she doesn't want anyone to see him like this. So he then took off his jacket and covered the president's head and chest area, and she let go immediately, and they were able to wheel him into emergency room 1, where doctors began trying to save his life, because he was medically alive when he arrived at the hospital. He had light, ragged breathing. I think Agent Hill called it slight breathing or something like that. So he was breathing a little bit, very shallow breaths, and his pupils were dilated. And the doctors would report, I believe they said, a gaping hole in his head. And I've read some conflicting reports. However, I only want to tell you what I was able to verify thus far. And, based on that interview, the Warren Commission report, the HSCA report, and anything I saw mentioned, anything related to the review board, it seems as though, and the video, of course, which I also believe I misspoke in the first video, saying that the only surviving footage is the Zapruder film, the edited one. The original is lost to us as far as we know. It was in a safety deposit box, and the person that owned that safety deposit box died of a heart attack. And so the film is just gone now, the original, allegedly. And I did find another film, some footage that was actually shot from the opposite direction. It was on the president's left rather than the right. And I tried accessing that video again after I had seen it the first time, went through my friggin' search history, or my watch history, and could not find that video anywhere. So I don't know if it got taken down, but if anyone else knows where to find that, please let me know, drop me a link, because I wanted to kind of take a look at that and compare it with some of my notes and the other footage. Anywho, back on track now. The doctor said that he had a hole in his neck, a hole in his head, and his eyes were dilated. He had some ragged breathing, but he barely had a pulse. And so they had to cut the hole in his throat open wider in order to give him a tracheotomy to deliver oxygen to his lungs. He had blood in his lungs, presumably from being shot in the neck. He was probably swallowing or inhaling some of that blood. And so they did a couple of incisions in his rib cage to drain the blood out of his lungs, and femoral cuts, which they did blood transfusions through his femoral arteries in order to get blood in him and get it flowing. And so they were able to actually establish, positive breathing and blood flow and heartbeat. But ultimately, they determined that he was beyond saving. He would never be able to breathe and function on his own again. So he was pronounced dead at 1 o'clock. So he was shot at 12:30, and now, just a few minutes later, he arrived at the hospital. They started working on him, and he is now pronounced dead at about 1 o'clock p.m. And Governor Connolly, I actually recently read some reports, and I thought this was rather interesting. So I remember reading through all of this and thinking to myself, I would hate to be like a random civilian or anyone else that had been shot, that maybe by some stray fire or whatever around this time, because if you get wheeled into that hospital, everyone's focus is going to be on the president. They had pulled all the top surgeons and everyone to work on him. So I remember thinking, gosh, it would suck to be somebody else that got shot, because they're not going to be as focused on you. And I ended up stumbling on this, I think it was some pullings from an actual book that was put together by the surgeons that were there that day, or at least by someone that interviewed them. Okay, so what I had found was an article quoting the doctor, an MD there, Theodore Pappas, and he had said, and I quote, so he was a medical student and was quoted as saying, Connolly was unattended for several minutes, gasping for breath with a collapsed lung, until a resident inadvertently walked by or into the room and saw what was going on. He was quoted as saying, then there were 30 people trying to save a dead president, and someone says, there's a guy who shot across the hall. You go and see who he is. To another doctor, Duke. And that other person in the room with Connolly was a urology intern who didn't know what to do. So doctors Duke and Pappas would say that his chest wound was baseball sized. His fifth rib was shattered and his right lung was collapsed. And then also a Secret Service agent came in with a machine gun, according to what they said, and told the doctors to scram for a security check. So supposedly, I think these were all quotes from a book called We Were There, and maybe like some varying interviews with, the doctors that were there at the time. So, the president, he's pronounced dead at 1 o'clock, and Connolly, he's being worked on. He has a hole going through his back and coming out his chest, through his wrist and hand, and his right thigh. Secret Service agent O'Donnell was trying to urge the First Lady to... Is she still the First Lady? Yeah, I suppose she is. He's urging her to get out of there. Like, we need to get you back to D.C. And she said, I'm not leaving without my husband's body. I'm not going anywhere. And so they said, okay, we need to secure a casket to transport him. And so Agent Hill actually went and got a hold of some hospital staff and asked them, where can I get a casket? And they put him in touch with a nearby facility, and he was able to arrange for a casket. And pretty quickly, they were preparing his body to be put in the casket and ready to transport him. Hospital administration, however, would come down and say, what are you doing? I believe it was actually, let me see here. So the coroner from the hospital said, there's a law in Texas that a homicide victim's body cannot be moved until an autopsy has been performed. So they asked, well, how long is that going to take? And he said, it could be 2-3 hours. It could be all day. And they said, this is unacceptable. So they came to an agreement that if a medical doctor could stay with the body throughout the transportation process to the destination where it would be autopsied, then they would find this, I guess, acceptable. And so they volunteered Admiral George Berkeley, who was the president's personal physician, to accompany the body all the way to where he would ultimately be autopsied. So also something interesting that I remember hearing in that interview with Agent Hill was that the shot through, back here that came out in his throat, it was low enough that it had actually nicked the top of the knot in his tie. So the president was brought to Love Field, the airport, around 2 p.m. So about an hour after he was pronounced dead, he's ready to be loaded up. And so he's being loaded up by about 2:15 with some difficulty because, the door was not quite wide enough for the casket. And so they actually had to, according to Agent Hill, rip the handles off of the casket in order to get it to fit in. And, whoever the mechanics were assigned to Air Force One, they actually had to, somebody obviously must have contacted them because they had to remove the rear seats in order to make room for the casket. And they probably had to do so fairly quickly. And if you know anything about aircraft maintenance, almost nothing's easy. So that was probably fun for them. But he got loaded at the rear of the plane. And then, fearing that local officials might delay the departure or prevent them from taking off, Secret Service agent O'Donnell requested that the pilot take off immediately. However, he was told they would be delayed because when they had arrived on the plane, before Mr. and Mrs. Kennedy, Mr. and Mrs. Johnson had arrived sooner, and Johnson, the then VP, Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson, he had phoned to D.C. Then Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson had contacted the Attorney General, Robert F. Kennedy, Bobby Kennedy, and he had told him you should swear in before you take off while you're still on the ground. And so they had to try and get a judge. So Judge Sarah T. Hughes was rushed in to swear him in. And Jacqueline Kennedy had agreed to stand next to him for the swearing in. Yeah, so she had agreed to stand next to Johnson for the swearing in, but she refused to change out of her bloody clothes. She said, quote, well, I guess not quote, but she wanted people to see what had been done. So at 2:38 p.m., Lyndon B. Johnson was sworn in as the 36th President of the United States. And 9 minutes later, the plane took off. So at 5:58 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, they landed at Andrews Air Force Base. Given a choice between the Naval Medical Center at Bethesda, Maryland, and the Army's Walter Reed Hospital, Jacqueline Kennedy had decided on Bethesda because John had previously served in the Navy. So Mrs. Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, and 3 Secret Service agents accompanied John F. Kennedy's body to the Naval Hospital at Bethesda, Maryland, which was a 45-minute drive. And on the 17th floor of the hospital, they joined other members of the family to await the conclusion of the autopsy. The hospital received the body for autopsy around 7:35 p.m. Eastern Standard Time and began the autopsy around 8 p.m. X-rays and photographs were taken preliminary, and the pathological examination began at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. It stated JFK was 46 years old, 72 inches tall, 170 pounds, blue eyes, and reddish-brown hair. And it listed the cause of death as gunshot wound, head. The autopsy concluded at about 11 p.m., and then the body was prepared for burial till about 4 a.m. So some of the details in the autopsy report, and this is interesting, I actually was able to confirm this through some of the findings in the HSCA report, which is the House Select Committee on Assassinations. The original notes were actually destroyed, and I haven't confirmed it through what I consider to be very legit sources. However, I have heard it said that his reasoning was because he didn't want, because the original autopsy papers they had the president's blood on them, and he didn't want them to become like a national treasure. So he redid the whole thing from memory. This is what I've heard. Again, I think that's an interesting little tidbit, but I don't know for sure that it is actually fact. But it does seem that the original notes were actually destroyed. That can be confirmed. And so here are some of the findings in that autopsy. So the eyes were dilated, but different amounts. The right was 8 millimeters and the left was 4. So the autopsy reports 2 head wounds. One is a 1/4 inch by 5/8 inch, aka 6 by 15 millimeters, located about 1 inch or 2.5 centimeters to the right and slightly above the large bony protrusion, known as the external occipital protuberance, which juts out at the center of the lower part of the back of the lower part of the back of the head. And the second is listed as being about 5 inches or 13 centimeters in its greatest diameter, but it was difficult to measure due to fractures. And so the specific quote is, "There is a large irregular defect of the scalp and skull on the right, involving chiefly the parietal bone, but extending somewhat into the temporal and occipital regions. In this region, there is an actual absence of scalp and bone, producing a defect which measures approximately 13 centimeters in greatest diameter." Then the report breaks down the location, which is basically between the ear and the eye socket. The other one, low anterior neck at approximate level of the 3rd and 4th tracheal rings, is 6.5 centimeters. Long transverse wound. Upper right posterior thorax. Just above the upper border of the scapula, there is a 7 by 4 millimeter oval wound, 14 centimeters from the tip of the right acromion process and 14 centimeters below the tip of the right mastoid process, which I will show you some crude drawings that I made that kind of show what those locations are, because let's face it, most of us probably don't know what those terms are. It says multiple fragments from the point of impact cut right through his brain tissue, and made a lot of damage. There were bits of metal chiefly above the right eye socket. And they also received from Dallas, I think the Secret Service agents had actually retrieved some pieces of skull that had been blown out, and it made up for about 3/4 of the missing portion from this region. And there is a report on the brain after formalin fixation, which is where they use formaldehyde to preserve it. And as promised, here's my crude drawings showing so This is what was described as the point of entry on the head wound here, right around this area here. And then this would be around where the exit wound was. And then also shown over here. So here's his back, and that's about where it went in. The one that came out the neck, and then the one in the head, and then that's about where they came out. So there's my crude drawings explaining everything that I said earlier with, all those medical terms that we don't understand. So there is a lot of disagreement around the autopsy and, did the autopsy match what the doctors had to say, and what really is the truth. If you look online, you can find some images that are allegedly non-doctored images or allegedly doctored images of the autopsy. I have looked at quite a few of these. I don't think I'm allowed to put them up on YouTube, so forgive me. But you're welcome to search them yourself. Be prepared for some weird dreams after. But, there was one website that put forth that the exit wound isn't what I just described and that the doctors disagreed about it. I've done so much friggin' research, I can't even remember, but based on some of the reports, it all matches. And based on some websites that interviewed some of the doctors, it actually doesn't match. And that came forth later. So there's a lot of conspiracy theory around that. We know one thing so far, and, well, we'll get there, but it was definitely a conspiracy. And I'll get to all that. Kind of, this is the buildup that gets us there. But I try to base my conclusions on what I can actually see in the Zapruder film, which I would like to believe, hasn't really been doctored to the point that the entry and exit wounds are going to be anything other than what I describe them as, because you can clearly see what very much looks like an exit wound right around, this area. And that does kind of line up with what these official reports said. It is, however, of course, suspicious that immediately after this guy dies, the new president who had the most to gain, right? Like, different people had different things to gain. Well, the guy who gets to be president now, because his predecessor is dead, well, that's Lyndon B. Johnson, right? And he immediately established this Warren Commission with Chief Justice Earl Warren to investigate the death, even though there were already going to be plenty of investigations by the police, the Secret Service, the FBI, the CIA. So that was interesting. And then to come out later and find out that the Warren Commission just kind of put stuff in their findings report that confirmed their preconceived notions, and they ignored any evidence contrary to it. So I'm not saying he was involved. I'm just saying that's an interesting thought, I guess. Something else that I read in the HSCA report was that we were at the brink of war under Kennedy. I mean, he was a mainly beloved president. So apparently under him, under John F. Kennedy, we were at the brink of World War III, or regarding Germany and the Soviet Union, and a Premier Khrushchev. So, talking about Kennedy, maybe that was one of the reasons that someone might have had motivation to have him killed. The brain actually went missing from the National Archives. I have yet to confirm that from a legitimate source, or rather one that I feel is more legitimate. I'm not saying that that's wrong. That would be absolutely very fascinating if it is true. But that is a rumor out there. It may be true. I would wonder what the reasoning would be for that. I've heard it put forth that, maybe it was to hide the fact that the autopsy and everything lied about the extent of the wounds or the location of the wounds, or to cover up other substances that he may have partaken in. I've also heard something else about his doctor was actually someone who gave out prescriptions for speed or whatever, allegedly. I don't know. And supposedly that's where the song Dr. Feelgood came from. I can't really confirm that. It's just a little something I heard. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe, and I hope you want to stick around for the next part. So next part will be part 3. As I alluded to earlier, it's about Jack Ruby, the man who shot Lee Harvey Oswald. And Lee Harvey Oswald was the only man accused of shooting President Kennedy. After part 3, I'll start going into other possible connections and other people that might have been involved, including different agencies or groups. I hope you enjoyed this. Please stay tuned for more. So part 3, I'm going to focus on Jack Ruby, who walked right up at the police station and shot Lee Harvey Oswald, who was the only person accused of assassinating the president. And then, later parts we'll talk about Oswald and some other people that may have been involved and some possible connections. So please stay tuned if you want to hear more.